Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the conference on the coherence of relativism. I think we had just a wonderful day yesterday with the inspiring presentations and fruitful dialogue, and I think you all join me in looking forward to another rewarding day together. It is my great pleasure to introduce my teacher, Michael Forster, chair of Theoretical Philosophy here at Bonn University and co-director of the International Center for Philosophy. He's also a regular visiting professor where I studied at the University of Chicago. His interests in philosophy are actually quite extensive, though he's best known, I think, for his work in German idealism and for his books on German philosophy of language, Hegel, Kant, Herder, Wittgenstein. I know that early on in my graduate career, an essay of his that caught my eye was on the very idea of denying the existence of radically different conceptual schemes. I think that's how our dialogue on relativism got started. And I was really happy to discover that on the side, Michael also had an interest in anthropology, and that was also something that we could talk about in a philosophical context. Today he'll be drawing on both his interests in ancient philosophy and in relativism, historicism, conceptual differences. And the title of his paper is Protagoras' Relativism. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the very kind introduction, Alyssa. This is really a strictly historical paper, so this won't be philosophically ambitious. The sort of genealogical ideas that I was just mentioning at the beginning of the conference would be stuff for another paper. So this is really just about Protagoras, this paper. And I will give some criticisms at the end, but I wouldn't claim, at least not hastily, that there are any grand, broad lessons for relativism to be drawn from the specific criticisms of Protagoras I'll be making. So Protagoras is known for three main philosophical doctrines: relativism, agnosticism about the gods, and the theory of moral education that he presents in the great discourse of Plato's dialogue Protagoras, which with much of the secondary literature I take to be a pretty faithful statement of what the historical Protagoras actually said and believed about these issues. In this paper, I'd like to try to make sense of these three doctrines, especially Protagoras' relativism, and to show how they fit together. To conclude, I'll then offer a few critical reflections about his relativism in particular. So let's begin with the relativism itself, or the man-measure doctrine, as it's often known. Concerning this, we're fortunate enough to have Protagoras' own words. They go as follows: man is the measure of all things, of those that are, that or how they are, the Greek particle is ambiguous between that and how, of those that are, that how they are, of those that are not, that how they are not. Plato quotes this doctrine in the Theaetetus and subjects it to an extended critical discussion there by his mouthpiece, Socrates. Though Plato is a hostile and less than completely reliable witness, his discussion provides invaluable clues to the doctrine's intended import. The following are some of the most noteworthy features of the doctrine that Plato helps us to see and understand, I think. First of all, it's extremely striking in the context of the 5th century that Protagoras' doctrine only identifies human beings as measures or authorities, but excludes the gods. Plato implies in the Theaetetus that this feature reflects Protagoras' doctrine of agnosticism or skepticism concerning the gods. 162 C to E. For those, some of you may be interested in pursuing some of these passages, so I will give the Stephanus numbers and so on periodically. And this explanation seems extremely likely to be correct, and I'll return later to Protagoras' agnosticism, but that remark I want to make up front. Secondly, it's a little less clear whether Protagoras also in his doctrine means to exclude animals. The wording of the doctrine certainly suggests so. Man is the measure, I mean, or human beings are the measure, there's no mention of animals. But the fact that in Plato's Protagoras espouses a relativism concerning the beneficial or the good that concerns not only human beings but also animals and even plants, that's 333d and following, might tempt one to suppose that he would, after all, include animals, perhaps even plants as well here as well. So you might be drawn in that direction by that passage in the Protagoras. However, Plato in the Theaetetus implies in the course of an explicit discussion of animals that Protagoras did not in fact include them, though in Plato's own view he should have for the sake of a sort of internal consistency, thereby though reducing the whole doctrine to a sort of absurdity. So that's the stance that Plato takes, and it implies that he didn't actually include animals. The key to reconciling the wording of the doctrine and this testimony concerning its limited scope with the evidence from the Protagoras I just mentioned about plants and animals probably lies in noting that the sort of relativity of the beneficial or the good to animals and plants that Protagoras champions in the Protagoras doesn't involve any attribution of cognitive states to them. Presumably he in fact denies such states to animals and plants and therefore excludes them from his relativism concerning truth. Thirdly, Plato in the Theaetetus in addition explains the doctrine as a doctrine that things always are for a human being just as they appear to him to be. This is 152a. So that, for example, if the wind appears to be cold to me but appears not to be cold to you, it is cold for me and it is not cold for you. It seems very probable that this was indeed the historical Protagoras' position. So it's a very specific and rather radical, perhaps even unattractive form of relativism that he's committed to. Fourthly, Plato in the Theaetetus implies that Protagoras moreover developed the individualistic character of this doctrine that's evident in this radical version to even greater extremes. Since things may appear in opposite ways even to a single person at different times, the doctrine more strictly holds either one or the other of the following two positions. And Plato's a bit vague about which Protagoras himself held, but the difference is actually perhaps not that important. Either, A, that the way things appear to a person at a time is always how they are for him then, or B, that the way they appear to a person is indeed always the way they are for him simpliciter, but that he becomes a different person whenever his appearances or beliefs change. And that's all discussed in several passages beginning at 154a. It seems probable that Protagoras did indeed espouse some such radicalization of the doctrine. Fifthly, and in the opposite direction, so to speak, Plato also implies in the Theaetetus that Protagoras was prepared to, as it were, some similar appearances shared by all of the individual members of a certain group, for example, a polis, a city-state, or even all human beings, when such shared appearances occur, and to say that things really are for the group as they appear to the group, because they appear that way to each of its individuals. So it's 167c and various further passages you'll find this position. As we'll see later, Protagoras' argument in the Great Discourse in Plato's Protagoras assumes the legitimacy of such a summing as well, since it assumes that what appears to all Athenians or to all human beings is the case for them. On the other hand, several of Plato's further characterization of Protagoras' doctrine in the Theaetetus seem likely to be false, or at least very misleading. First of all, Plato's equation of Protagoras' doctrine that things always are as they appear, with a doctrine that knowledge is perception, and the terminology is quite different, phainasthai on the one hand, aesthesis on the other, seems quite dubious. Most of the secondary literature thinks so too. As we'll see in more detail later, Protagoras discusses several types of appearances or beliefs that are not, in his view, perceptual in character, including appearances or beliefs concerning gods, geometrical points, and a case where admittedly the non-perceptual character is a bit more ambiguous, morals. Consequently, it seems very likely that his relativist doctrine was meant to apply not only to perceptual cases, but also to non-perceptual ones. Recall that the famous fragment opens saying man is the measure of all things, right? The all is explicit. And it seems likely that the doctrine's term appear, or Phinasthai, therefore had a correspondingly broad meaning, signifying not only perceptual seeming, but also something more like belief in general. It in fact seems probable to me that Plato arrived at this mistaken interpretation by conflating Protagoras' relativist doctrine with another doctrine of Protagoras' that really does concern perception, and which I'll discuss later. Roughly, it's a doctrine that among all the relatively true appearances or beliefs, those that are perceptual in character are to be preferred in a certain way over those that are not. Secondly, Plato in the Theaetetus represents Protagoras' relativism as rooted in a secret doctrine that he shares with Heraclitus and others, to the effect that nothing is, but instead everything is only becoming. However, this interpretation again seems quite implausible and has been rightly rejected by even more of the secondary literature. Thirdly, Plato in the Theaetetus argues that Protagoras' relativist doctrine succumbs to a problem of self-contradiction because it implies that the many people who believe it to be false are correct in this belief. We've been talking about this already yesterday. It's 171b to c. But this Platonic objection notoriously depends on disregarding the fact, amply reported by Plato himself, indeed even in a passage immediately preceding the objection in question, that Protagoras didn't claim that a human being's beliefs are always true simpliciter, but only that they're always true for him. It's noteworthy that Plato, in addition, develops an interesting variant of this self-refutation argument, just before it, in fact, in the text, in which he points out that since most people disbelieve Protagoras' relativism, it is by Protagoras' own lights false for many more people than it's true for. This is 170d to 171a. This variant of the argument isn't guilty of the error I just pointed out. You know, it's not doesn't make play fast and loose with the relativizations in that way. However, nor does it constitute an incisive objection. It's actually quite clever than it can appear, in that, as we'll see, or as we would see if I had time to talk more fully about the theory, Protagoras' theory of education, Protagoras himself sometimes appeals to what is true for people in general, or for the Athenians in general, and moreover supports democratic decision-making practices. So there's a certain sort of ad hominem cleverness to Plato's argument, but it's by no means clear that Protagoras always appeals to what is true for such broad groups, that he entrusts decisions on all issues to democratic decision-making, or that he's in any way bound to do either of those things. Consequently, concerning his own relativist doctrine, he might instead simply allow that it's only true for him and his followers, and perhaps in addition hope that through their influence it will become true for more people in the future as well. Fourthly and finally, Plato implies in the Theaetetus that Protagoras or his followers, and he's ambiguous between those two things, concede an exception to the relativist doctrine that all appearances or beliefs are true for the person holding them in the case of beliefs concerning future advantage. So this is 172b and further passages. However, Plato himself equivocates between actually ascribing this exception to Protagoras and merely ascribing it to some of his followers, and it seems to me unlikely that Protagoras himself would have conceded any such exception. The counterintuitiveness of denying mistakes in that case, while it's undeniable, doesn't actually seem greater than it does in more straightforward cases, you know, where mistakes about present phenomena or whatnot are involved. If Protagoras' relativist doctrine wasn't motivated by a Heraclitean secret doctrine, what really did motivate it? So what was the argument, or what were the arguments behind it? What justification did Protagoras offer in its support? As far as I can see, he has two main philosophical grounds for it. The first ground was as follows. As Plato's Theaetetus shows, Protagoras was very impressed by what he took to be the fact that on every question human beings pass different and indeed incompatible judgments. That, for example, the wind seems cold to me, but seems not to be cold to you. In the Theaetetus, Plato limits this point to sensory perception, but it seems probable that Protagoras actually meant it more broadly. Hence, Plato himself implies in the Sophist that it also included, and I quote, divine things which are invisible to the many. This is 232c. He doesn't use the name Protagoras, but he's talking about the Sophist, and Protagoras, as is natural, was obviously the paradigmatic sophist. And Aristotle implies that it also included geometers' beliefs concerning invisible points. This is in the Metaphysics of 997b and following. Moreover, it clearly also included moral judgments, though, as I implied earlier, it's possible that Protagoras considered moral judgments to be concerned with matters of sensible perception. That's actually quite an interesting issue to pursue, but rather tangential to this paper. This can be seen from the fact that the famous parody of Protagoras' anti-logic that appears in Aristophanes' play The Clouds from 423 BC focuses indeed on moral oppositions, and it can also be seen from the fact that the so-called disoilogoi, or double arguments, a sophistic text dating from the end of the 5th or the beginning of the 4th century BC, actually so a little bit after Protagoras, that's strongly influenced by Protagoras, centrally discusses oppositions between people's moral convictions as well, notably including, and again this is a point I think of considerable interest but rather tangential to the paper, notably including not only oppositions that arise within or between Greek communities, but also ones that arise between Greeks and other peoples, such as Indians and Egyptians. In addition, Protagoras evidently held the view that such oppositions between our judgments cannot be eliminated by means of arguments, because against every argument that's given, it's possible to find an equally strong opposite argument. Accordingly, Diogenes Laertius reports that, and I quote, he was the first to declare that there are two possible positions on every question opposed to each other, and indeed he was the first to present arguments along these lines, adding that he published 2 books of opposing arguments, Antilogiae. This first ground for Protagoras' relativism is fairly obvious from the relevant texts, and would moreover still be found persuasive, at least in its generic form, by many relativists today, I think, in one version or another. So we can quite easily sympathize with this line of support for the doctrine. But Protagoras also has had a second ground for his relativism that's less textually obvious. To my knowledge, only one commentator has really noticed it, and that's G.B. Kerford, and which would be much less immediately attractive to modern relativists, but not necessarily the worse for that. I actually think it's the assumptions made here are, while they're likely to strike us as just sort of weird, are actually quite philosophically deep ones. In a neglected passage of the Euthydemus, Plato implies that Protagoras took over from Parmenides, first of all, the doctrine that no one can ever think or say anything false, anything that is not, but only something that's true, something that is. Together with, 2, the implication of that doctrine that people can never really contradict each other, since otherwise, in light of the doctrine, contradictions would have to be true. So if you're averse to contradictions, you're committed to this implication. This is Euthydemus 283e to 286c. These 2 positions, Parmenides' doctrine and its implication, evidently made an important contribution to the motivation of Protagoras' relativism, and, moreover, determined its specific form, namely its insistence that a person always thinks or says something that's true for him, or perhaps more precisely, true for him at a specific time. Protagoras' relativism's insistence on truth does justice to Parmenides' doctrine that people can never think or say anything false, but only something true, while Protagoras' relativism's insistence on the relativity of the truth in question, that this is always a matter of truth for so-and-so, does justice to Parmenides' doctrine's implication that people never really contradict each other. If I say or think P and you say or think not P, then what I really mean is that P is true for me, and what you really mean is that P is not true for you, so we don't really contradict each other. Protagoras' reliance on this second line of argument shows, I think, that his position can't only be that when I think or say that P is true and you think or say that not P is true, P is true for me and not P is true for you. It must in addition be that when I think or say that P is true and you think or say that not P is true, I mean that P is true for me and you mean that not P is true for you. For if he were to allow that I meant that P is true simpliciter and that you meant that not P is true simpliciter, he would fall victim to a fatal dilemma, I think. For either he'd have to say, in light of the Parmenidean argument, that we were both correct, which would not only conflict with his insistence that truth is always merely relative, but would also commit him to the truth of a contradiction, P and not P. Or he would have to insist, in light of his relativism, that we must both, strictly speaking, be thinking or saying something that's not, since there's a discrepancy between our thinking or saying that it's true simpliciter and it's really only being true relatively, which would conflict with the Parmenidean argument that doing this, saying something that's not, is impossible. This reading of Protagoras' relativism as a doctrine not only about truth but also about meaning is significantly supported by the fact that, as I mentioned before, in the dialogue Protagoras, he develops a strikingly similar doctrine of the relativity of the beneficial or the good, because this doctrine in the Protagoras seems even more clearly to be a doctrine that construes relativity as part of the very meaning of the terms in question. And in that case, it's actually quite a plausible view to hold that those terms of phalemos and agathos were indeed meant relatively. In particular, for example, the term agathos, good, wasn't restricted to human beings in everyday Greek. You could talk about a good knife, for example. And so this is an analysis of meaning would not have been at all implausible, I think. The second, more surprising ground for Protagoras' relativism that I've just identified, this Parmenidean ground, deserves a little further discussion. In particular, I'd make 4 points here. First, the fact that Protagoras was committed to this Parmenidean doctrine for his own relativism not only explains the precise form that his relativism takes, as I just mentioned, but also explains the precise form that the Platonic dialogues, Theaetetus and Sophist, take. In both of these dialogues, it can initially seem quite puzzling that Plato begins with Protagoras, or with the Sophists more generally, and then transitions to what look like more or less independent philosophical problems concerning the possibility of thinking or saying anything false. The solution to this puzzle is that both in Plato's mind and as a matter of historical fact, the two topics in question were not independent of each other, since the doctrine that it's impossible to think or say anything false, that one can only think or say something true, was a central component of Protagoras' position, and to that extent of the sophistic movement more broadly. Second, Porphyry reports that Protagoras wrote a work called On Being that was directed against Parmenides. At first sight, this might seem to contradict the interpretation I've just given, according to which Protagoras owed his second ground, his second justification for his relativism, to Parmenides. However, Porphyry in addition reports that what Protagoras specifically objected to in Parmenides' position was his conception of the unity of being. And the position that I've ascribed to Protagoras is, in fact, perfectly consistent with this report, because Protagoras' relativism, in effect, multiplies being. There's not just being simpliciter, but instead being for me, being for you, being for Smith, being for Barack Obama, and so on and so forth. Thirdly, as Kerford has pointed out, it's prima facie puzzling for an interpretation along these lines that, on the one hand, according to such an interpretation, Protagoras denies the possibility of opinions that contradict each other, whereas on the other hand, he himself famously champions opposing arguments, antilogiae. However, this is not really all too puzzling on reflection, I think. Presumably, Protagoras holds that the arguments that at first sight seem to oppose each other by contradicting each other, in fact do so only in a different way, roughly in the, not in the manner of leading to the conclusions P and not P, but rather in the manner of leading to the conclusions P for me and not P for you, if you're the source of the argument. Fourthly, it's somewhat more stubbornly puzzling for the interpretation I've been offering here that Protagoras himself uses the concept of not being without any evident embarrassment in his two most famous doctrines. As we've already seen in the man-measure fragment, his relativist doctrine describes human beings as the measure of things that are not, that or how they are not. And as we're going to see in a moment, his agnosticism about the gods says that concerning the gods, he neither knows that or how they are, nor that or how they are not. So again, this is just ambiguity in that particle of that how bit. How can this apparent contradiction be explained? You know, that he's talking happily about what's not himself. In this connection, it's perhaps worth noting to begin with that the historical Parmenides in his poem is guilty of similar apparent contradictions. In that case, there are, I think, basically two interpretive options available. Either Parmenides simply overlooked the contradictions in question, or he had an implicit strategy for diffusing them. For example, the sort of auto-eliminative dialectical strategy that Montgomery Firth has, I think, quite plausibly ascribed to him, which in the end leaves standing only a single statement, it is, which actually looks even more wonderfully monistic in the Greek, where it's just a single word, esti. Similarly, in the case of Protagoras, there are, I suggest, essentially two interpretive possibilities. Either Protagoras simply overlooked the contradiction. That can't be completely ruled out, but I think it's fairly unlikely in light of his usual philosophical acuity. And it would, of course, also yield a philosophically rather disappointing interpretation. Or Protagoras thinks that he can provide a relativistic interpretation, perhaps reinterpretation, of thoughts and statements about not being, that in the end frees them from Parmenides' objection. For example, he may think that his relativism fundamentally makes all cases of not being into cases of not being for someone, and hence into special cases of being. That somewhat resembles the strategy that Plato develops in the Sophists, the much more famous strategy Plato develops in the Sophists for making room for predicative not being by, in effect, reinterpreting it as a form of positive being. And some of you will know the story about how that goes. It's not relevant to us now, but it may be a similar strategy. It might even have inspired Plato to some extent. I consider this second possibility both more interpretively plausible and more philosophically interesting. Okay, so that by way of a kind of first shot at least sketch of Protagoras' relativism, I want to go on now to talk about his agnosticism. Protagoras is not only famous for his relativism, though, but also for his agnosticism or skepticism about the gods. Here too, we're lucky enough to have his own words. Concerning the gods, I'm unable to know either that or how, again that ambiguity, they are, or that or how they are not, nor how they are in form, for much prevents one from knowing the unclarity, adolotes, and the brevity of human life. So that's the famous fragment on the gods, about the gods. This doctrine, like Protagoras' relativism, was something quite new in the history of Western thought, indeed quite possibly in the history of thought tout court. As far as we know, nobody in Greece before Protagoras had simply called the existence of gods into question, let alone denied it. That did happen in his train. Critias, for example, seems to be a case in point. It's true and indeed important to note that Protagoras owed a good deal here to his predecessor Xenophanes' skeptical reflections concerning the gods. So this claim of sort of originality in this area requires a little bit of qualification. But Protagoras also modified and radicalized those reflections of Xenophanes in some important ways. Just to spell this out a little bit, in particular, it's true that Xenophanes had already championed a sort of agnosticism or skepticism about the gods, as well as all other subjects he was interested in. In fragment 34, he says, "And now concerning certain truth, nobody has seen it, and there will be no one who knew it in relation to the gods and all the other things I mention." It's true that also that he'd grounded this agnosticism in terms of conflicts between human beings' conceptions of the gods. He says the Ethiopians say that the gods are snub-nosed and black, the Thracians that their gods have light blue eyes and red hair, that's fragment 16. And it's also true that Protagoras almost certainly took over both of these positions from Xenophanes in some form or variant. But Protagoras also modified and radicalized them in at least two crucial ways. For one thing, he added to Xenophanes' appeal to conflicts between human beings' conceptions of the gods an appeal to the availability of opposed but equally strong arguments in this area. This is implied by that Sophist passage, 232b to c. For another thing, his agnosticism was much more radical than Xenophanes' agnosticism had been. Xenophanes only denied that we have certain knowledge of the gods. Accordingly, he himself, in fact, championed a positive theology, rather an ambitious one, namely a form of monotheism according to which the single God who exists is quite different from human beings and, himself immobile, causes the motion of other things through the sheer power of his thought. By contrast, Protagoras denied, or at least for himself, any knowledge of the existence or the characteristics of gods, and renounced any opinion about these matters. So that's the agnostic doctrine he holds. However, Protagoras' agnosticism remains puzzling in several ways, especially concerning how it relates to his relativism. It's true that both doctrines share a certain very generically skeptical character. In addition, as I've already pointed out, his relativism, as stated in the man-measure fragment, evidently presupposes some form of the doctrine of agnosticism. But on the other hand, when one takes a closer look at it, it's by no means easy to see how the two doctrines can be compatible with each other. So I'd like to pursue that question a little in the hope that doing so will lead to a more exact understanding of Protagoras' position. As far as I can see, there are three main puzzles in this area, which I'm going to describe and attempt to resolve in turn. I'll take the last two of them together because I think they have a common solution. A first puzzle is simply that relativism on the one hand and agnosticism or skepticism on the other, agnosticism or skepticism in a strict sense on the other, are usually incompatible with each other and compete with each other. It's true that they typically respond to similar problems that arise concerning beliefs or knowledge claims, for example, the problems of opposite appearances and arguments, but whereas relativism solves these problems by relativizing truth and allows that all sides are correct, skepticism stricto sensu instead declares the problems to be unsolvable and consequently renounces belief. The solution to this puzzle must, I think, be roughly as follows. Since Protagoras understands his relativism and the grounds that generate it to be quite general in their validity, he must also hold the view that they apply to convictions concerning the gods in particular. That, for example, that when Smith believes that there are gods, this is true for Smith, and when Jones believes that there are no gods, this is true for Jones. But that doesn't preclude there being individual people who have no opinion or who withhold judgment in this area. And when Protagoras expresses his agnosticism, it's striking that he seems to go out of his way to emphasize that this is only a matter of his position. He says, concerning the gods, I am unable, and so on. Presumably in order to lay claim to precisely this possibility of a consistency with his relativism. But two further puzzles remain in this general area. He's not out of the woods yet by any means. So a second puzzle is this. What I've just said doesn't completely remove the tension between Protagoras' relativism and his agnosticism or skepticism. For even if, for the reasons just mentioned, these two doctrines do not themselves stand in contradiction with each other, there still seems to be a sort of inconsistency concerning their grounds. This is because it seems, at least at first sight, that the grounds that support Protagoras' agnosticism concerning the gods are similar to those that support his relativism. In particular, the sophist 232b to c implies that he applies his normal method of anti-logic to the gods. But in that case, ought he not either to add to his relativism a personal agnosticism or skepticism on all topics, or else, in the case of the gods, as in other cases, leave it just as his relativism? Why the asymmetry? So there's this kind of residual inconsistency. Thirdly, a third problem, or puzzle, Protagoras' man-measure doctrine does indeed, as I pointed out, seem to presuppose a form of his agnosticism about the gods, but at least at first sight, it doesn't seem to presuppose exactly his form of it, but instead something considerably stronger. Not merely a suspension of judgment about the gods, but something more like a denial of them. After all, his relativist doctrine says man is the measure of all things, not merely as far as I know, man is the measure of all things. I believe that these two remaining puzzles have the same, or at least very closely related, solutions, namely as follows. The solution to the first of them, let's say puzzle, let's say the second puzzle in my list of three, must, I think, lie in the fact that Protagoras actually sees an additional problem afflicting convictions about the gods, which doesn't apply to most other convictions, and which therefore justifies and explains the asymmetry of his position in the two cases. What's the additional problem? Well, it's basically that the gods are not sensuously perceptible. Incidentally, there's a kind of backstory to that view, because it's although it may seem like a perfectly natural view to take about gods to us, within the Greek tradition, it actually took some development of Greek religion and theology in order to arrive at such a sort of an assumption about the gods. But I'll bracket that question for now. Accordingly, Plato reports in the Sophist that Protagoras' anti-logic included a coverage of divine things which are invisible to the many, 232b to c. And in the fragment in which Protagoras states his agnosticism, he gives us the main reason for his lack of knowledge concerning the gods, the unclarity, the adeilotes of the subject matter. Moreover, in a further fragment that's been preserved and commentated on by Didymus the Blind, Protagoras seems to trace a similar unclarity in an analogous case, more explicitly back to the absence of perceptibility. And Didymus seems to interpret Protagoras as considering this a reason indeed not merely for suspending judgment about, but even for denying the facts in question. So here's this less well-known fragment. Protagoras says that being, for things that are, consists in their being perceived. He says, and then there's a quotation, "It's clear to you as being present that I'm sitting. No one who is not present, however, to one who is not present, however, it is not clear that I am sitting. Therefore, it is unclear, and adelon is the word, whether I'm sitting or not sitting. That Protagoras accorded the sensuously perceptible a sort of preference over the sensuously imperceptible in this way can be seen from several other pieces of evidence too. For example, as I've already mentioned, Plato famously claims in the Theaetetus that Protagoras went as far as to identify knowledge with perception. And Aristotle reports that Protagoras undertook to refute the opinions of geometers that a stick, in other words a straight tangent, touches the periphery of a circle only at a single point, by noting that perception, on the contrary, shows that such a stick touches a whole line along the periphery of the circle. But how exactly did Protagoras prefer convictions about the perceptible over convictions about the imperceptible? Since the arguments for his relativism, especially the Parmenidean argument, are perfectly general in nature, it can't be a matter of an advantage in terms of truth and falsity here. In Protagoras' view, all convictions are true, namely for the people who hold them. Instead, it must, I suggest, be a matter of an advantage of a pragmatic sort. For Plato reports in the Theaetetus that although Protagoras didn't hold that convictions differ with respect to truth and falsity, since again that all beliefs are true for the people who hold them, he did hold that certain convictions are superior to others in respect of their usefulness. This is at 166d to 167b, as Dorothée mentioned yesterday, the one person who's made a certain amount out of this passage and this line of thought in the Theaetetus, this pragmatic tendency, is F.C.S. Schiller in a work from 1908. So presumably Protagoras' position was that convictions about perceptible matters are more useful than convictions about imperceptible ones, and are for this reason preferable to the latter. This solves the first of the two remaining puzzles, since it explains why, despite the fact that he has largely similar grounds in both cases, Protagoras' position about the gods on the one hand and most other matters on the other is asymmetrical. It also makes possible a solution to the other remaining puzzle, this third puzzle in my list, because it shows that Protagoras' attitude to the gods was in the end closer to being a denial of them than to being a mere suspension of judgment concerning them, to the extent that he not only failed to believe in them, but in addition, for these pragmatic empirical reasons, rejected the question of their existence as useless. And this explains why the man-measured fragment implies not merely a suspension of judgment concerning the gods, but rather something more like a denial of them. Okay, so the third part of the paper is all about Protagoras' theory of moral education as one finds it in Plato's Protagoras in the Great Discourse. For reasons of time, I'm not going to be able to go into this. It's actually, I think, if you're interested in sort of moral philosophy and in particular the theory of moral pedagogy and so on, it's an extraordinarily interesting aspect of Protagoras' position. That's an extraordinarily valuable aspect of his position. But for the topic of relativism and agnosticism, it's perhaps slightly more tangential. The gist of the points I was going to make was that, in effect, there are two puzzles when you come to this great discourse in the Protagoras that ought to strike you immediately. And one is that the great discourse is sort of set up in a way by Socrates offering three arguments against the teachability of virtue. But he does so in a very peculiar way for Socrates, in that he argues, in effect, in an ad hominem vein from the assumptions of the Athenian democrats and their assembly, from the assumptions made by their democratic leaders, Pericles in particular. And of course, Socrates doesn't typically construct constructive arguments in an ad hominem way. Think of the Crito, for example. He's arguing from his own beliefs from the get-go there, albeit with the agreement of an interlocutor. And he certainly never has sympathy with the Athenian democracy or its leaders, right? So there's a very peculiar puzzle as to why Socrates is presented this way in his opening arguments in the Protagoras. And then there's, of course, the puzzle also that Protagoras himself says in his counter-statement, do you want an argument or a myth, a logos or a mythos, and what exactly that distinction amounts to. And then Protagoras launches into this counter-statement, and he's talking about the gods and all the rest of it, and how they gave virtue to human beings for various reasons, and so on and so forth. And so those are two puzzles. Why does Socrates argue in this funny way, and why does what does this distinction amount to? And I think what it turns out, to make a long story extremely short, is that Protagoras' relativism explains the first thing. What's happened is that Protagoras, in his speech, presumably already the historical Protagoras, had argued in accordance with his relativism from the viewpoints of the Athenians, and perhaps humanity more broadly to some extent, but mainly from the viewpoint of the Athenians. There can be no question of establishing truths implicative for Protagoras, so it's a perfectly natural thing to do. He's addressing the Athenians and so on. And so these initial opposing arguments that provoke that statement are presented on the same playing field, as it were, by Plato. Presumably, I think it's very likely, this is a part of the argument that one can also find evidence for, presumably because Protagoras himself had started out with those kinds of arguments against the teachability of virtue. There's evidence that he'd done that, and had done so again in his relativist vein. So I think that's the answer to the first thing. The answer to the second puzzle, what's the distinction between mythos and logos, is beyond the generic point that you can actually see from the great discourse itself, that the idea is roughly the distinction between simply saying how you think things are and what the real reasons for things being that way are. Instead of just saying that, which is giving an argument, you might also sort of dress it up in allegorical terms, or fictional, in a way that has fictional components, and that would be the mythos. But the additional precisification of that way of construing what he's doing that you get when you think about his broader position is that, yes, and in particular to among those fictional components was all the stuff about the gods. Because Protagoras doesn't believe in the gods, right? He's an agnostic about the gods. So you have to subtract all of the references to the gods and turn the story, the Great Discourse, into a purely naturalistic account in order to see what he's actually getting at, what he's really saying. And so that's the gist of it. And then when you do that, what you end up with is you find an absolutely superbly subtle, I think, argument for the teachability of virtue. And it's also an argument that has very interesting democratic implications, which is very interesting because we're extremely short of democratic justifications for democracy from the ancient world through the historical accident that our main political philosophers from that period were anti-democrats like Plato and Aristotle. So much by way of an account of Protagoras' relativism then, and how it fits together with his other two main theoretical contributions, known as agnosticism about the gods and his theory of moral education. The overall position I've ascribed to him strikes me as an impressive one, not only for originality and sophistication, but also for the ways in which he argues in support of his positions and for the ways in which he makes them cohere with each other rather than conflicting. But to say that his position is impressive isn't quite to say that it's actually correct, and actually I think it's flawed in various ways. In particular, his doctrine of relativism itself seems to me vulnerable to some serious objections. So I'd like now, in conclusion, to briefly make some critical observations about it. One weakness of the doctrine lies in the fact that, as we saw, it appeals to Parmenides' paradox of not being as the source of one of its two main grounds of support. and moreover as the source of the ground that determines the specific form the doctrine takes, namely that of holding that whatever appears to an individual to be true is so for him, and of being not only a doctrine about truth, but also a doctrine about meaning. The problem here isn't that Parmenides' paradox is fallacious, as much, maybe even most of the secondary literature has taken it to be. As I argue in detail elsewhere, given the intellectual context of his time and place, Parmenides was actually fundamentally correct in seeing a contradiction in the notion of thinking or saying that something that is not. It's a kind of anachronistic reading that would make that problem disappear. The problem is rather that there is a much better way of avoiding the contradiction than Protagoras' way. Parmenides' own solution of ultimately foregoing all claims except for it is was certainly far too drastic to be attractive, but Protagoras' solution is only slightly less drastic, for example, in its denial that people ever make mistakes. Moreover, there's a significantly better solution to the paradox available than either Parmenides or Protagoras' solutions. This better solution essentially consists in positing intentional or abstract objects to serve as the relata that are required for acts of thinking or saying something that is not. Paradox is roughly that, you can't, saying or thinking is not like, say, sleeping, where you can sleep without sleeping anything, right? It's an intransitive verb. It's more like beating. You need to have something that you beat. You have to have something that you think. You have to have something that you say. And so how can you think or speak at all when the thing doesn't exist? That's roughly the paradox. And the solution in question, which of course we are likely to take to be completely self-evident today, but certainly wasn't at the time, is you posit a domain of something like intentional objects to serve as the relata, even in cases where the thing discussed itself does not exist, or the fact itself does not exist. As I've argued elsewhere, this better solution was already adumbrated by Protagoras' contemporary and fellow sophist Gorgias, and was subsequently developed in a more elaborate and subtle form by the Stoics, not by the usual suspects, Plato and Aristotle, by the way. Moreover, it's basically the solution that we still rely on today. This leaves just Protagoras' other, more textually obvious and more enduringly popular ground in support of his doctrine of relativism, his observation that on all topics things appear to individuals in opposite ways and that such oppositions cannot be resolved by argument because there are always equally plausible arguments on both sides. One problem with this ground for relativism is that it's far from clear that there really are opposite appearances on all issues, or that there really are equally plausible arguments on opposite sides of every issue, even in the modified sense of opposite that Protagoras ultimately allows. Protagoras, along with other sophists, devoted much labor to trying to establish these claims, for example, in his two books of anti-logic, and much of the philosophical tradition, for example, ancient Pyrrhonists have sort of continued that program. But while the results of these efforts are often locally impressive, it remains far from clear that they justify or ever could justify anything like the very strong claims that there are always opposite appearances and that there are always equally plausible arguments on both sides. One obstacle here is just that there are many appearances or beliefs concerning which it's very difficult to find opposite appearances or equally plausible counter-arguments. For example, the proposition dogs are not spaceships, the proposition the moon is not made of marzipan, and the proposition 1 + 1 is 2. Another obstacle is that attempts to cope with such challenging cases, for example, by appealing to deep differences in cognition between cultures or by entertaining the renunciation of very fundamental principles of logic or arithmetic, typically import a change in the key concepts involved, albeit perhaps sometimes a subtle one, so that strictly speaking there's no opposition between the appearances or beliefs in question or between the arguments on both sides. In principle, both could be correct. A further problem with this remaining ground for relativism is that even if a perfectly general occurrence of opposite appearances and equally plausible arguments could be established, relativism would by no means be the only reasonable philosophical response to such a situation that was available. One obvious alternative would simply be to insist that despite the ubiquitous conflict of appearances and the ubiquitous equal balance of arguments, it must nonetheless be true that in each case one of the two sides, at least one of the two sides, is mistaken, so the other side is, or maybe at least, correct, and to hope that one's on the right side of that battle. Another alternative response would be the classic skeptical response of suspending belief across the board and instead living by one's own non-epistemic, that's to say non-belief containing appearances. Finally, besides the inadequacy of Protagoras' justifications for his relativist doctrine, there are also more direct problems afflicting the doctrine itself. One such problem concerns Protagoras' commitment to saying not only that a person's thoughts and statements that such and such is true are always true for him, but also that they always mean only that such and such is true for him, not that it's true simpliciter. There are certain cases of relative terms concerning which it really is plausible to make such a claim that people always already meant them relatively. For example, Protagoras' other case of the predicate useful, or perhaps the predicate good, or the case of the predicate big, for instance, or for that matter, an example that Plato himself uses in the dialogue of the Euthydemus, the predicate father is a father. This is roughly because the plausibility of claiming that these are always already used relatively is because in such cases people either already have an outright reflective awareness of the relativity involved and hence could explain it in a reasonably accurate way, or would at least react to relevant test cases with a sort of, say, dismissiveness or amusement that makes it reasonable to impute an implicit awareness of the relativity involved. For example, if one objected to their statement that this weapon they're using is useful, but its victims don't find it so, or if one objected to their claim that Smith is big, but he's not, but he's so much smaller than these hills, they would react to the objection dismissively or with laughter, not with a sort of stunned puzzlement or whatnot. By contrast, in other cases where we want to say that terms turn out to be relative, it isn't plausible to claim that they were always already meant that way by people. Rather, they were at first meant absolutely, but it's turned out for various theoretical reasons that this was not a good meaning to attach to them, that they should instead be reconfigured relatively. Examples of this would be the terms upwards and downwards before people knew that the Earth is a sphere with similar gravitational properties all over its surface, or in motion, the term in motion before astronomy and physics taught us that motion is always relative. Now, the problem for Protagoras is that the predicate true seems to be like these latter cases, not like the former ones. For example, if one objects to a person who said that P is true, that in fact not P is true, he will not normally dismiss or laugh at this response as he would in the case where one objects to him that the weapon he said is not useful for its victim, or in the case where one objects to him that the man he said is not big when compared to certain hills. On the contrary, he'll normally think that there's a real dispute between himself and his objector, and this surely shows that he meant his claim to truth not relatively, but instead absolutely. So as a semantic thesis, I think Protagoras' thesis has problems. Some further direct problems concerning the coherence of Protagoras' relativist doctrine. As I've noted, Plato's peritrope argument, this turning the tables argument against it doesn't work. However, some closely related objections to it seem to have considerably more bite. In particular, if, as he evidently must, Protagoras concedes that the relativist doctrine is itself only true relative to himself, perhaps even relative to himself at such and such times, and for other people who likewise adopt it, and moreover, as he again evidently must, that this concession in its turn is only true for himself and for those other people, and so on ad infinitum, then while such a position may not actually involve any actual self-contradiction, as Plato supposed, it nonetheless remains very unclear whether it's really intelligible. Moreover, even if it is intelligible, it's very doubtful that espousing such a position could amount to having a belief or to making an assertion. And if not, then it's unclear what sort of cognitive or linguistic performance, if any, it is. So these are slightly softer problems than the one Plato hoped to generate, but they're still, I think, pretty severe. In short, for all its philosophical subtlety, Protagoras' relativism doesn't, in the end, seem tenable. In consequence, the extent that his agnosticism and his theory of moral education implicitly presuppose it, they too are problematic and would need to be revised in order to become defensible. Whether his relativism could be recast in such a way that it could avoid all of the problems just discussed is a large question that I won't try to answer here, but fortunately one can at least say that both his agnosticism and his theory of moral education could be detached from his relativism without suffering great disruption. That's the end. Thank you.